The Beatles are one of the most famous bands of all time, defining an era of not only rock, but also England's and perhaps even the wider West's popular culture as a whole. They were everywhere, and quite frankly, it was very difficult to avoid them if you happened not to like them. A perhaps equally famous English contemporary of the Beatles was, of course, J.R.R. Tolkien. You may be surprised to know that not only did he dislike the Beatles and the music they produced, but also their impact on popular culture. So much so that he was directly involved in shutting down a movie adaptation of The Lord of the Rings made by the Beatles themselves in the 1960s. You see, although the professor wasn't a fan of them, it has been reported that the Beatles, and primarily John Lennon, absolutely loved and were obsessed with The Lord of the Rings, and their version of a Lord of the Rings musical starring the Beatles almost got the green light. Going back to Tolkien for now, it is no secret that the professor was what can only be described as a traditional Englishman and a man of his time. Born towards the end of the Victorian era in 1892, by the time the Beatles came around in the 1960s and rock really grew as a genre alongside others, Tolkien was already in his 70s. For him, proper music was what we would call today classical music, and some of his favorites included Sibelius, Weber, and Verdi. Already from the 1940s, he can be seen complaining about the way music was progressing during the time. In Letter 77, written to his son Christopher in 1944, Tolkien writes, "Music will give place to jiving, which, as far as I can make out, means holding a jam session round the piano, an instrument properly intended to produce the sounds devised by, say, Chopin, and hitting it so hard that it breaks. This delicately cultured amusement is said to be a fever in the USA. Oh God. Oh Montreal, oh Minnesota, oh Michigan, what kind of mass manias the Soviets can produce remains for peace and prosperity and the removal of war hypnotism to show. Not quite so dismal as the Western ones, perhaps, I hope." 20 years later, in 1964, his views regarding this type of music did not change. In fact, in letter 257 to Christopher Bretherton, he complains about how noisy life was becoming and how much it affected him personally. Specifically, he noted, "But Headington is no paradise of peace. Sunfield Road was a cul-de-sac when I came here, but was soon opened at the bottom end and became for a time an unofficial lorry bypass before Headley Way was completed. Now it is a car park for the field of Oxford United at the top end, while the actual inhabitants do all that radio, tele, dogs, scooters, bus bikes, and cars of all sizes but the smallest can do to produce noise from early morn to about 2 a.m. In addition, in a house 3 doors away dwells a member of a group of young men who are evidently aiming to turn themselves into a Beatle group. On days when it falls to his turn to have a practice session, the noise is indescribable." Here, as you can see, he's not referring to the actual Beatles themselves, but rather uses the type of music they produced to describe the sort of noise that continued to annoy him. When we attempt to look into the details behind the failed Lord of the Rings adaptation by the Beatles, we get some indicators of Tolkien's dislike. By the late 1960s, the Beatles were still contractually obligated to make a third feature film with United Artists, and John Lennon pushed the idea that this film should be The Lord of the Rings, which the band had read and fallen in love with some years prior. John would be Gollum, Paul Frodo, Ringo would be Sam Gamgee, and George would be Gandalf, with Stanley Kubrick being offered the director's position. Kubrick refused due to the scope of the movie, but what ultimately killed the whole project was J.R.R. Tolkien himself, who still held sway with the rights of the movie adaptation. Over 30 years later, during the Academy Awards of 2002, Peter Jackson himself asked Paul McCartney what happened with the planned adaptation of The Lord of the Rings. Paul revealed that it was Tolkien who rejected the idea definitively, and he didn't like the thought of the Beatles being involved with his book. In J.R.R. Tolkien Companion and Guide, it is written that at the end of 1968, there were reports that the Beatles might be involved with a proposed film of The Lord of the Rings. On January 7, 1969, Joe Hill wrote a memo to Rainer Unwin after a visit to Tolkien. Professor Tolkien is getting more and more furious about this because it seems that the Beatles are announcing plans in connection with the film. He is livid that the Beatles have done this and loathes them anyway. Particularly, he seemed to have a thing against John Lennon. This is corroborated in George Allen and Unwin, A Remembrancer, where it stated, he became positively angry when he read a news item in the Hollywood Reporter that United Artists, with whom the indefatigable Sweeney was negotiating the rights of The Lord of the Rings, were making exploratory noises about involving the Beatles. Tolkien threatened to withdraw entirely if that was the case, and over a year later I was still trying to reassure him that it seemed unlikely to have been more than a rumor. Both of these quotes have their sources in people who knew Tolkien personally and were involved with publishing the Lord of the Rings books in the first place. Statements that he loathed them and repeated mentions throughout multiple sources that he was furious at the thought of their involvement paint a consistent picture about the professor's opinion on the Beatles. Now, him not liking the music itself and perhaps not wanting it to be affiliated with his work is understandable. But is there something deeper going on? The Beatles were an instrumental part of the 1960s counterculture movement throughout the West, and the frenzy surrounding them must have certainly worried Tolkien, even on a philosophical level. His stance against celebrity worshipping was well known, and to have it be connected with social causes and ideals that the professor himself may have disagreed with must have certainly deepened his negative feelings towards the group as a whole, and certainly their involvement with his book. Themes of youth rebellion, psychedelia, and the prospect of modern culture heading in this direction through the youth are just some of the things that Tolkien would have opposed. Moreover, widespread accusations of disrespect against Christianity and overall hostility towards aspects of traditional English life must also be considered. Therefore, a combination of music taste, values, and different generational experiences all contributed to what the sources described as Tolkien's loathing of the Beatles, and, of course, why he ultimately rejected their involvement with a Lord of the Rings movie. In the end, Paul McCartney told Peter Jackson that he was quite happy with the movie not taking place, because it gave space for the movie trilogy that we know and love to be made decades later. A massive thank you to my channel members, and thank you very much for watching.